Supervise PhDs, a podcast series by Tara Brabazon and Steve Redhead. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon.
And I'm Steve Redhead.
And welcome to our second podcast in our series, How to Supervise PhDs. And our second podcast is a special one for both students and prospective supervisors. We're asking, how do you find a good supervisor? And so this is a warning for students in some ways, but it's also a warning for staff to think about how they can become the best supervisor they can be. So Steve, let's start with the obvious first question. How would you recommend students find a good supervisor? So they have a project or an idea, they perhaps got a good honours degree, they've done a coursework masters perhaps. Where do they start to find that supervisor?
Yes, it's a good question. I find that in my daily professional life as Sub-Dean of Graduate Studies in the Faculty of Arts, I'm having to ask that question all of the time. And you're going across 6 schools within the Faculty of Arts at Charles Sturt University, trying to find good supervisors and appropriate supervisors for the appropriate students who apply. I think a record is important.
Yeah.
I think a record of writing or of supervisions, particularly supervisions to completion, is important, so that students should look at that, should look at what the potential member of staff has actually done, and increasingly you can look at that on the net now. So it's possible to find that out before you even apply to particular institutions.
And I'd advise they do that.
And
too.
I think they should do that, yeah. Find out as much as they possibly can. Research it. But that doesn't mean to say that you shouldn't look at a supervisor who's only just started supervising,
Indeed.
for example. So there's always that kind of catch-22. But I think for students, they should research it. And they can, and they should do. And they should have a good, solid project that they've thought about, rather than just something on the back of a fag packet before they go to the supervisor. So I think research about it is a very important starting point.
Yeah, and I agree with you, and you've captured a lot of that there. You need to have the research track record, so you need to see the publications. But someone can have all the publications in the world and actually not be a good supervisor.
Yes.
So you need to have both, but I would also argue there's a third element there. They've got to actually be a decent person. And so, indeed, the web searching can give you some of that sense that if a staff member isn't behaving well or something's gone wrong, you will often find something like that online. So you've got to be careful because there's trolls and all the rest of it. But I think you need all three. I think you need someone who is research active in the field that you're interested in. They have experience and expertise in doctoral supervision, and they're actually a decent, stable person.
I think that's a much more difficult thing, though. The personality and the person is something much more difficult to research. And I think students, though, can research the background in general, and they can find out about publications where they've supervised before. And I think at one time that did used to be the way that people found people, but now the system, I say, is globalised, but is also bureaucratised as well.
Oh, yeah.
And it's quite a difficult process, is this.
Yeah.
Certainly in terms of the way that we work at Charles Sturt University, there are lots of good systems in place, but very often we're missing out people who actually are potentially very good supervisors and may have published but haven't supervised, partly because they're just in working individually and they haven't really got onto the ladder yet. That's a really difficult thing, because a lot of those people could fit all of your criteria.
Absolutely.
But they may not be found out about by the student. And
can I just offer a second important point there, and that's why really high-quality sub-deans or deans of graduate studies matter, is, guys and gals, you may have someone on their journey through their research in their early to mid-20s that have done a PhD, and they are tremendous human beings. Put that person in your co-supervisory panel.
Yeah.
Tell you why. Because if they're 25, 30, they'll write you references for 30 years.
Yeah, I think so.
So the mixture actually matters, and in some ways it's like a good chef. A good sub-dean or a good dean of graduate studies puts in the person that's got all the things we've talked about, but then finds that sparky, interesting, wonderful, enthusiastic co-supervisor, and that's how they gain their expertise. So that's important to think about.
And I think also the Council for National Academic Awards, CNA, in the UK, which I worked on for a decade, actually deliberately brought in that sort of system where you would have not the Oxbridge system where you just have one person who would supervise from time to time. You actually did get a system of Director of Studies and second supervisor, partly in order to mentor the second supervisor who was likely to be a young academic who had not supervised before but wanted to supervise and was really starting their career. And I think where that works well, that's great. Chadstone has a system like that where you have the idea of a more senior supervisor but also a second supervisor coming on board. And that mix that you talked about is very important, I think. And if the student is looking for one person, they've got to understand, in my view, that actually you're probably going to have a supervisory team, and that sometimes that can be a problem, but in general that's a benefit.
Let's go to the second one, which is this series is in some ways about supervisors as much as students. So how can a great supervisor find great students? We're sitting there looking at our inbox, emails are beeping in with profound regularity, Skype's up, the phone's up, all sorts of mechanisms exist for students to approach us that didn't exist 10, 15 years ago. How do we, as good or great supervisors, find those great students that will finish?
Yeah, I think that's much more difficult. You would have thought that this would be now a globalised system, but it's really hit and miss, I think. And in some cases, it's going to be a matter of you've got a narrow academic interest, and that's what you've published in, for example, and what you've supervised in, and to some extent, then that cuts down the potential number of students. But if you're working particularly in interdisciplinary areas, you're going to get all sorts of people coming to you, and you just don't know what the relationship is going to be like. It's very, very hit and miss. So I think, but what you can do is get a good profile online, an accurate profile. I think that's quite important, up to date, so that people can around the world actually find you and know what you're doing now. There's a lot of times, people's websites are out of date, and even their material on university websites is way out of date, decades in some cases.
So triangulate your data, have a good look at it.
Very much so, yeah. Keep that profile going and keep it up to date, partly because then you will get more appropriate fit if students find you.
That's fantastic. And also I think you've raised that issue that I think particularly impacts on you and I, and maybe other listeners as well, that interdisciplinary issue. So often, very often in our case, we are supervising outside of a particular school or a particular faculty. At the moment, I think I have more PhDs in the Faculty of Arts than the Faculty of Education. We may be doing work with science in healthy ageing, some work in sport. So that adds a certain level of complexity as well, that if you've got interdisciplinary staff, then they'll have interdisciplinary students. So don't always, guys, go and have a look at one particular faculty. Look for the topic, and you might surprise yourself, I think. Yes,
and it's quite often difficult as far as graduate studies management is concerned. Yes. I find every day I'm dealing with other sub-deans in other faculties at Charles State University precisely because of this issue.
Yes, and hopefully we are very kind to you, Sub-Dean of Graduate Studies, when you're dealing with those other faculties.
But it's not obvious sometimes with the applications themselves by the students, because the students don't necessarily see that interdisciplinarity, whereas actually when you start to look at what they're asking for, it is an interdisciplinary thing. And I got one the other day where someone who's I had a tremendous background as a CEO in companies, but also in academia, wasn't sure himself whether he would be in the Faculty of Business or Faculty of Arts, and we're still wrangling with that potential supervision.
And so those conversations actually are very important. I spend a lot of time on Skype these days. When students approach me, I now have a chat with them via Skype, and that's adds brilliant. A lot more personality to it. But you spend a lot of time with that gentleman, talking through
personally interviewing, having a face-to-face meeting. But the Skype thing is really good. With tyranny distance is over. You don't necessarily need to have someone in your room talking as you would have done 30 years ago.
Absolutely.
You can talk on Skype and see whether that interdisciplinarity works.
Exactly, and the fit, personality.
Yes, the fit,
personality terms.
Yeah, the fit is crucial.
Let's see if we can do this one almost as a checklist. Don't know if we can. If I was going to ask you, Steve, what are the characteristics of a good, nay, great supervisor, what would they be in your mind? The characteristics of a good supervisor.
I think someone who is going to have ultimate concern for you as a student.
Spot on.
I really do. Because so often what the seeds of the crisis, what I would call a crisis in PhD supervision, is to do with the fact that supervisors have basically had these interests, very often funded interests, research-funded interests from research councils or private bodies or whatever, and that inevitably has determined the kind of supervision they're doing. So the student is on the back of that rather than the student being the most important in this thing.
Yeah.
And I think keeping the interests of the student, someone who is able to keep the interests of the student, and ultimately that is to produce a high elite qualification for that student successfully, is actually the most important thing. Yes. You know, they can have all the publications in the world and all of the research council grants in the world, but actually that issue of the interests of the student is massive.
I'm glad you're saying it. That is the number one draft pick from my perspective, that this staff member has done enough in their career that they can park their ego at the door and say, you know what, this supervision is about you. I often call it, and podcast listeners have heard me say this in the past, intellectual generosity. I think what that means is you've done a good job and you're very comfortable with who you are and you don't need to rip anybody off to continue your career, and you've got enough time and enough juice and enough intelligence to give a little bit away and look after that student. So I think that's important. I also think, for example, Steve, the availability of time, very difficult because you're going and you're dealing with senior people. This is we deal with this challenge every single day. So often you are dealing with very senior, therefore very busy people, who often in your case are a sub-dean, in my case a head of school, and fitting in half an hour of meetings, or once a week, can often be incredibly difficult. But you need to make sure the person is committed that deeply that they find that time. If they have to get into work at 7 o'clock in the morning, they have to do whatever they need to do, that they will see you. So that time availability matters. Time to read the material really matters. That can be challenging. I think we've got a 65-page document to read from Anne today. I have 120 pages to read from my other student, Mick, tomorrow. So this is Saturday and Sunday. So it's that sort of commitment. It is that belief in the student. It's very easy to just go, oh, look, I'm going to do my work, and there's plenty of work I could be doing. But actually finding those 4 or 5 hours for the students each day, that's important. Also, I think it's about temperament. This person has got to be even. This person can't be a lunatic. This person can't be angry, aggressive, not quite in control of their own emotions. I think they have to be pretty even.
And also I think if the student's interest is that is the ultimate aim, and I think the best supervisors do put that forward, they are also, in a sort of selfish way, the thing about a PhD is that they do eventually learn things they don't know. Yeah. PhD is about an original contribution to knowledge, which is an elusive concept. But I think, in my experience, certainly the best students I've supervised have actually taught me so much in terms of the content of the work, but also about how you should supervise successfully and so on. So I don't think you ever stop learning about the supervision if you have the interests of the student uppermost. If it's only about your interests as a supervisor, which it very often is, as I say, then it can be a problem. And that's why the interests of the student matter.
I think that's brilliant. I think it's very important. You raised content there in your answer, and I'm very interested in your answer to this, and I don't know it. What is the role of content expertise in determining a good supervisor? So expertise in the knowledge field.
Well, ultimately, if I'm right that PhD is an original contribution to knowledge and that's an elusive concept, the content is going to be a matter of the student eventually knowing more about that content than the supervisor. But I think that takes quite a long time. in a particular PhD and the trajectory of it. So I think content is important. And very often, I mean, I think it partly depends on the disciplines, but if you go into, I don't know, PhD in the law or socio-legal field, for example, quite often, if it is a really specialist area, and I've had these, then the content at the beginning, and even for the first perhaps 18 months or so, content knowledge can be really significant. I don't just mean a knowledge of the legal rules, say, in that particular case, but a knowledge of a really specialised field in sociology of law or interdisciplinary legal studies. That's why you do need to make this fit. It can't just be anybody that you're supervised by, although that person's content knowledge may well be superseded by the PhD student
and actually
eventually.
Definitely will be.
Yeah.
Should be.
Yeah.
The only other thing I'd say to you is there are surprises that happen, and I will use one of our current students that we share as the great example of that, Anne McLeod. Anne McLeod is working on early childhood education. Now, Steve, you won't mind me saying, but perhaps early childhood education is not a great area of your expertise, but theories of professionalism are.
Yes, so theories of professionalism, debates about professionalism and the professions, law, medicine, dentistry, teaching or policing or whatever. I've actually learnt a great deal from this PhD supervision in an area that I thought I didn't have a great deal of expertise in, as you say. And by bringing in sociologists of the professions like Terry Johnson, whose work we've kind of resurrected with Anne McLeod, has actually taught me a lot. So you can be really surprised in terms of content.
It's made her thesis on early childhood education much bigger and more important and resonant, and will have a much wider publication and access than if simply 2 early childhood specialists had supervised it.
Yes.
So surprises happen, so be open
really
to the surprises too.
Yeah. And no, it's a great example.
Astounding. And final question on this one, Steve. How important is a history of PhD completions to finding a good supervisor? And notice I used completions, not just supervision there.
Yeah, completions is very important, I think, the history of completions, because so many supervisors around the world have started to supervise, and then for various reasons students fade away. I've completed 30 around the world successfully in my career, but I've lost ones as well.
That have broken your heart.
There have been supervisions
broken your heart,
where I really thought they would be the ones who would complete, and they didn't. For all sorts of reasons. That taught me all sorts of things, but also there are still question marks about my own supervision and the way I dealt with some of those that haunt me in some ways, because I thought that I could have told you that they would be completed. So I think you have to think about that. You have to see whether people actually have completed, because completion is a long-term thing. It really does involve a lot of the commitment and the difficulties that we've talked about already in this podcast series. And if you can find people who have completed, I think that's really important, because that suggests something.
It does.
If they're actually just supervising, and it may look really exciting and innovative and so on, the actual completion is a very important thing. So the record of completions, it seems to me, is well worth taking into account.
I agree. And also, it is like, if I use the metaphor of a marathon, the PhD supervision and completion is a marathon. So simply because somebody has trained for a fun run, which is having a go at supervision, any fool can sign a form and be a supervisor. I used fool intentionally there. Any fool can go, oh yes, I'll have a go. But the commitment, the training, the focus to get to a completion is a completely different gig. And also I'd say to you, and again, I think podcast listeners would have picked up the sort of resonance in your last answer, Steve, that when things have gone wrong, and I've had a couple and you've had a couple, and it shatters you, it breaks your heart. And the thing is, I think a great question for a prospective student to ask a prospective supervisor is, tell me about the supervisions that didn't complete, and what did you learn from that? And that's even people as senior as Steve and I, we would appreciate that question, and we would tell you. We would tell you, what did we learn? And the idea that we're tortured and it haunts us 10, 15, 20 years later shows how seriously we take it. So if it's like, oh, look, it just happens and the student went away, that's the person to avoid, because this does matter and your completion does matter. And we are haunted by, is there something we could have done differently? And often I think in those cases, probably not. But it is interesting for us and productive for us to think through that process. Thank you, Steve. Wonderful one. Thank you for listening to this podcast titled How to Supervise PhDs. Please feel free to contact Steve or Tara at Charles Sturt University. We'd love to hear from you.